So today in class, we're going to finally get to the topic that we have been dancing around all semester, the question of virtue. And when we're talking about virtue, what we're really asking is, do people have capacity to develop some sort of internal habits that can direct them to choose the good in a way that is appropriate for each particular circumstance? A theory of virtue requires some of the points we made about actions earlier on in the semester. Remember when we were discussing theories of action in moral theology, we noted how in Veritatis Splendor, John Paul II had distinguished between moralities that are based on sort of some sense of the fundamental option and moralities that are based on legalism. Very crudely, moralities based on a fundamental option basically say, well, if you have chosen to orient your life to the good or towards God, that's what really matters. It's your basic orientation. Your individual actions don't count. Moralities that are based on legalism take exactly the opposite perspective. They say, well, the only thing that matters is your actions insofar as they conform to a specific law. Your intentions and the context don't matter in determining if an action is praiseworthy or blameworthy, if it is good or evil. Virtue theory requires that both right intention and right actions are necessary for an act to be wholly good. Both what you intend to have happen and what you actually do matters. And so this is how it works out. Virtues, in the classical definitions, are habits of the soul that orient us to right actions. One way to define them is internal principles of action, what direct us to the good, as opposed to laws, which are external principles of actions, external sources of information that impose upon us what the good is. Virtues are internal principles that direct us to the good. However, for a virtue to be functioning, you have to not only do the right thing, but because a virtue is an internal principle, you have to have the right interior orientation. You have to actually desire the good. Another term for virtues are the idea that virtues are a stable disposition. I've been saying a habit a lot, but you can also, habit would be an analogical reference to the physical habits we develop. We often use the term disposition to refer to habit or to a overall character. What type of person are you? How do you what's your disposition? How are you disposed to act in specific situations? And dispositions imply a fundamental orientation, but a fundamental orientation that leads to action. So one more wrinkle in this. So we have virtue as the stable dispositions or internal principles of action, and I've said that they determine that they should lead to both good actions and good intentions. However, of course, what we all know is that we often may gut it out, may white knuckle it through and do the right action even without having the right intention. I may treat somebody with courtesy even when I really don't like them and don't feel like they deserve that courtesy. So in virtue theory, it acknowledges that we are always in the process of becoming. And the more you engage in the right action, the more your intentions are going to change as well. The more that, and we talked about this a lot when we talked about action earlier, the more that your individual actions change who you are and you start to develop the virtues so that you eventually start desiring to do the good. You don't just do it white knuckle, you do it because that is the way that you naturally act. Virtues become natural with us. So we will find, as people engage in the right actions, that they actually start to desire to do the right thing. This should take you all the way back to when pink hair, we talked in the beginning about pink hair as stages of moral development. We need the laws, we need the rules, we need the disciplines, we need these external principles to direct us to do the good. And eventually, if you do the good often enough, often those actions will change you so that you develop the internal principle of action and start to actually desire to do the good and to determine the best way to do the good even in changing circumstances, even when the context looks differently. So, in summary, a theory of virtue ethics requires that we take seriously all the components of an act that we identified earlier. Your intentions matter, the object of the act, your action, and the circumstances must all be considered for an act to be good and appropriate. So, virtues, as I just discussed, virtues ensure that we have the right intention. Virtues both orient us to the proper action for specific circumstances and are also developed through that action. And of course, virtue theory acknowledges that what may be the proper response in one situation is often not going to be the proper response in another situation. So virtues aren't just simply a rule of action, which is saying I act this way every single time, but rather a disposition to act appropriately even when a situation may change and may require different types of actions for you. We'll talk more about this when we talk about acquired virtue. Another way we can talk about the virtues is that possessing the virtues, all of the virtues, means that we possess right practical reason, that we have the ability to discern the proper way to act from a practical reason as opposed to speculative reason in whatever situation we might find ourselves. So virtues taken together as a virtuous disposition means that we will act properly. But what does properly mean? The classic formulation drawn from Aristotle as to what proper action means is described by the term the mean of the virtues. So that the virtue involves that the virtuous action will that be that which is the mean between two extremes, the middle course. Let me give you an example. A soldier, someone who possesses a paradigmatic version of the virtue of fortitude, will learn in training that the virtue of fortitude is going to be displayed differently at different situations. That you will need to act that in the field or on a base or in different situations in the field, the proper courageous action is not always going to be the same. The proper courageous action, however, will always be appropriately between the extreme of saving your life at all cost and sacrificing your life at all cost, between sacrificing your life for any reason, I should say, between cowardliness and foolhardiness. So the virtuous action will thread the needle between acting like a coward, so being scared of acting in a way that you're scared of everything and not willing to sacrifice or risk anything, and acting like a fool in which you are willing to take any risk, not counting the cost. Every virtue, the practice of every virtue, it requires the identification of the mean, and that's how we judge the virtue. Does it hit the mean between the two extremes? Also, talking about virtues, or that people accumulate different virtues, is more of a theoretical innovation. All the virtues are actually linked because it's about really the type of person you are. It's not that you have sort of accumulated all of these different virtues that you can put in your virtue piggy bank inside you. Rather, exercising any virtue requires prudence, requires discerning the right thing to do, requires assessing what is due to other people, requires moderating our fears and our desires. We talk about virtues separately to help us define and understand them better, but really we're talking about a person's overall character. So I just want to note that for you under the idea of the unity of the virtues. We'll talk more about this specifically in our next class, but one of the ways that classically and traditionally, going back to Aristotle, the virtues have been broken down is by considering all virtues, all the types, all the aspects of a stable disposition to the good that a person might develop under 4 core categories. The cardinal virtues of prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude. And we'll talk some more about what those are tomorrow, but I just want to flag this idea for you right now that there, as we're talking about the unity of the virtues, that there are 4 different areas that virtue can cover. And these are called the cardinal virtues. So far what I've been giving you is a discussion really of classical Aristotelian virtue ethics. The ideas that Aristotle came up with about how a person can grow and become a better person. A couple of things that are concerning about this approach. First, in Aristotle's understanding, the way that you grow in the virtues is through exposure to good models, through having good teachers and trainers, and through being around the type of people who are going to teach you how to take the right actions that are going to help you become, develop this disposition. I don't know if you can pick up on this from the way I described it, but what Aristotle really is saying is that only free men who happen to be born in families wealthy enough to give them a classical education are people who are truly able of accomplishing virtue. Everybody else, in his theory, is really out of luck at becoming a person who has the disposition to contribute to the life of the community, which is what he's really interested in. This is obviously problematic to Christians, given the emphasis within the gospel of Jesus Christ on the God's equal love for everyone, and the fact that, remember, Jesus is not someone who grew up in a wealthy family where he received a classical education, nor were his followers. In addition, this description leaves no room for the supernatural. It leaves no room for God's effect on the world and on us. So what Christians had to do, so Christians, as they started to think about how the culture around them, the world of Greco-Roman philosophy, understood what it meant to do the good, they had to figure out how to integrate this with the insights from the Christian tradition, the way the Christian tradition challenged these elitist ideas and identity, and the claims of the church that the Holy Spirit is active to change us from the inside out rather than simply the virtues, the development of, or the repeated actions building up these stable dispositions of virtue, changing us from the outside in. In other words, what does grace actually matter? Does God actually change who we are? So Christians were trying to figure out how to bring together these ideas about the good that people can achieve, the dispositions they can develop that they'd inherited in the Greco-Roman world, with a knowledge of grace and God's change and God's love for everybody. And they developed an idea, which we'll talk about in 2 days, called the infused virtues, the idea that God changes us from the outside or the inside out at the same time that we are doing something to change ourselves from the outside in. Like I said, we'll talk about that more specifically later. And the other thing I'd like to note for you is that virtue ethics draws on all, from the Christian perspective, draws on all the sources of moral theology that we've identified. It draws on Scripture. It draws on reason, the idea of discerning the good. It draws on tradition, because we understand the virtues through paradigms we were given, through images we were given, and it draws on experience, obviously, because of the importance of context. So I just want to flag that for you. We can discuss that more in class. And here are some questions relating to the reading to help you think as well. I look forward to discussing this more on Monday.